St. Helena Parish, Louisiana, December 25, 1854.
The night was too quiet. Even the dogs, usually restless and snapping at shadows, lay silent. Frost clung to the window panes of the overseer's quarters, catching the faint glow of a single lantern swaying from a rusty hook. Its light wavered across the wooden floor, stretching shadows long and thin like grasping fingers. Then, a creak. Bare footsteps on old boards. A figure emerged from the darkness, face hidden, hands steady. In his grip, rope, coarse and knotted, the kind used to bind bales of cotton. But tonight, it was meant for flesh. The overseer stirred, heavy with whiskey, his breath thick in the air. Before his eyes even opened, the rope looped around his throat. A sharp yank. His gasp cut short. His hands clawed at the cord, nails scraping skin, but the pull tightened. His chair tipped back with a dull thud. Across the room, another man awoke to the sound of choking. His lips parted to shout, but the shadows closed in. A second rope silenced him mid-breath. He kicked, boots thudding against the floor, eyes bulging wide, face purple in the lantern glow. The quarters filled with muffled cries, gasps that never became screams. Within minutes, silence returned. 3 bodies slumped where they slept. Their mouths hung open, eyes glazed. Skin bruised in ugly rings where the cords dug deep. The smell of pine smoke from the hearth mixed with sweat and fear, hanging heavy in the room. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell waited to toll for Christmas morning. But here, death had already spoken. Imagine standing in that doorway. Imagine watching the overseers, the men who carried whips and decided life and death, reduced to choking gasps and lifeless stares. You can almost hear the rasp of the rope tightening. You can almost feel the breath leave their bodies. The lantern flickered, dimming with each gust of wind sneaking through the cracks in the walls. For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. 3 men locked in their final expressions of terror. And then, movement. Just beyond the glow of dying firelight, a shadow lingered in the doorway. Breathing slow, silent, watching, waiting. Who were they? What drove them to turn rope into weapon? And how did they dare to strike first on Christmas morning, when the world above their heads celebrated joy and peace? Who were these shadows in the night? And how did they dare to slaughter the very men who held the whip? Christmas morning. In the great house at St. Helena Parish, firelight danced across velvet drapes. Silver goblets lined the long oak table, their rims catching the glow of dozens of beeswax candles. The smell of roasted duck and sugared pecans drifted through polished halls, mingling with the sharp bite of mulled wine. Outside, carriage wheels crunched on frosted earth as guests arrived, their laughter carrying like bells through the night. But only a few hundred yards away, in the cabins of the enslaved, Christmas was nothing but another word. Smoke leaked, weakly from chimneys built of cracked mud and straw. Inside, the cold bit at bare feet through broken floorboards. Mothers pressed their children close for warmth, their bellies empty, the taste of cornbread long gone from the night before. A rat scurried across the rafters. A baby whimpered, and its cry was muffled against a thin blanket. The difference was a chasm, an abyss. Here, luxury so rich it seemed obscene. There, suffering so deep it dulled even the meaning of hope. Imagine standing between those two worlds. Imagine hearing the echoes of a hymn sung in the master's parlor, while just beyond the window you could hear the coughing of a child who hadn't eaten in days. The same air carried both sounds. The same soil held both lives, yet one world feasted while the other withered. In the big house, gifts were unwrapped with shouts of joy, fine boots, ivory-handled knives, French perfumes shipped downriver from New Orleans. White children raced through the halls, their laughter piercing the morning. Their fathers raised toasts to prosperity, to another year of cotton, to another year of control. Meanwhile, in the cabins, slaves rose before the sun, shoulders aching, hands blistered from the harvest that had already broken them. Even on Christmas, there was no reprieve. The masters might drink and feast until they collapsed in their velvet chairs, but the enslaved knew they would still be called to serve, to clean, to stoke fires, to refill goblets until dawn gave way to another endless day. The cruelty of contrast wasn't just in wealth, it was in the way joy itself became a weapon. Every song of praise from the master's parlor was a reminder that those enslaved were forbidden such happiness. Every smell of roasted meat was a taunt to those whose stomachs groaned. One man, Elias, sat hunched by the dim glow of a dying ember, watching the shadows move across the cabin wall. He could hear the bells ringing faintly from the church on the hill. He could hear the clinking of glasses from the overseer's quarters where whiskey never ran dry. His fists clenched at his sides. His daughter, thin as kindling, lay coughing on a bed of straw. That morning, Elias whispered something, beneath his breath. A prayer, perhaps, or maybe a promise. Outside, frost still clung to the cotton stalks left unpicked. The plantation fields stretched endlessly, a sea of white under a pale dawn. To the masters, it was wealth incarnate. To the slaves, it was chains, stretching into eternity. And somewhere between the hymns and the hunger, the silence of the cabins broke. A whisper passed from one mouth to another. A word carried low, careful, almost inaudible, yet heavier than the crack of any whip. Revenge. Imagine it, standing in rags outside the warm glow of a house dripping in gold. Wouldn't you feel it too? That ember of rage buried under years of humiliation, beginning to flare into something else? The laughter from the big house carried on, careless, but beneath it, in the frost and shadows, something darker stirred. But the overseers had forgotten one thing, that even silence can plan. And this Christmas morning, silence was ready to strike. The massacre at St. Helena Parish did not begin in a single night. It had been growing for years, like rot spreading through wood, hidden until it splits the beams apart. For Elias, the man whose shadow lingered in the overseer's quarters, the breaking point had come long before Christmas morning. He remembered the day he was told his family would be freed. His second master, drunk on bourbon, had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've earned it. Serve me 2 more years, Elias, and you'll be a free man." For 2 years, he worked harder than ever. He obeyed every command. He endured every lash without a word. He whispered to his wife of the day they'd leave the fields behind, of the land they might buy, of the life they might carve out where their children would never know the whip. But promises are fragile things in the hands of men who never intended to keep them. The day his freedom was to be given, Elias was instead told he would remain property. Worse still, his wife and youngest son were sold downriver to a plantation in Iberville Parish. He had begged on his knees, tears soaking the dirt, but his master only laughed, calling him a fool for ever believing a slave could earn his liberty. From that day, something inside Elias shifted. Hope no longer lived in him. It had been replaced by something sharper. He was not alone in his bitterness. Others carried wounds just as deep. Abner, a wiry man with eyes that burned even in silence, still remembered the night his brother was beaten to death for stealing a heel of bread. He could still hear the overseer's laughter as the body was dragged away, discarded like waste. Rachel, a woman forced into the master's house as a maid, bore scars no lash had made. Her broken voice told enough of her suffering, but her silence told even more. Together they carried a weight too heavy to bear quietly. The betrayals stacked like stones until they formed a wall, trapping them, cornering them, leaving only one path forward. And then there was Christmas, the cruelest of ironies. For the enslaved, it was dangled as a season of mercy. On some plantations, masters might grant a small gift, or loosen the work for a single day. But here at St. Helena, Christmas was a spectacle of mockery. The masters would feast until dawn, singing hymns of peace and salvation, while their slaves waited, hungry outside the walls. Imagine that contrast. Imagine being told this was a holy day of joy and goodwill, while you stood barefoot in the frost, watching your child shiver as the smell of roast meat carried across the fields. It was on one such Christmas Eve that Elias made his decision. Not in rage, but in clarity. He would never see freedom in chains. He would never see justice in silence. If the overseers were the hand that tightened the lash, then it was their throats that would feel the rope. In the cabin, as others whispered, of hunger Elias whispered of vengeance. He told them of his broken promise, of his stolen wife, of the children he might never hold again. His voice shook, not with fear, but with certainty, and they listened. Rachel pressed her hand against the splintered wall, eyes wet but steady. Abner nodded once, his jaw clenched. Others leaned closer, their faces lit by the faint red glow of a smoldering ember. The plan was not spoken loudly. It was not drawn in maps or etched in letters. It lived in whispers, carried on breath, hidden in silence. The ropes were already at hand. No one would suspect their true purpose. Christmas would not be the master's day. It would belong to them. But as the frost thickened on the ground and the bells began to toll, one question lingered in the silence. If they struck, would they survive the storm of wrath that would surely follow? But this was only the beginning. The ropes had been braided, the timing chosen, and the dawn was coming. Night fell heavy on St. Helena Parish, as though the sky itself knew what was coming. A pale moon slipped in and out of clouds, throwing silver light across the cotton fields. The cabins were quiet, too quiet. No songs, no laughter, not even the tired murmurs of prayer that usually drifted out into the dark. Inside, men and women sat awake, eyes glinting in the faint glow of dying embers. The ropes had been prepared, hidden in plain sight among tools and bundles of twine. Every knot was tied with purpose, every strand twisted with rage. Outside, the overseers drank deep into the night. Their laughter spilled into the fields, harsh and careless. Boots stomped on wooden floors as dice rattled on the table. A dog barked once, then whimpered into silence. And in the shadows, the rebels moved. Elias led the way, his body tense but his face calm, as though his soul had already stepped beyond fear. Abner walked close behind, his hands raw from clutching the rope so tight his knuckles bled. Rachel lingered near the rear, whispering a prayer under her breath, though no one could hear the words. Each step toward the overseer's quarters felt like a step into a grave. The air itself seemed to thicken, carrying the smell of pine smoke, whiskey, and sweat. Imagine it, walking barefoot through frozen grass, knowing each sound might betray you. Imagine the hammer of your heart so loud in your chest you fear the overseers will hear it before you ever reach their door. They crept past the fields, past the whipping post that still bore stains from the lash. Elias paused there for only a moment, his eyes flickering over the darkened wood. His hand twitched as though he could still hear the screams that once echoed against it. Then he moved on. Closer now. The overseer's quarters glowed faintly, with firelight. Shadows swayed on the windows. The sound of drunken laughter bled through the cracks in the walls. One man cursed loudly, another broke into song. Inside the cabin, Rachel's breath caught. She clutched Elias's sleeve and whispered, "If they wake too soon." He cut her off with a glance. No words, only certainty. The group froze as a floorboard creaked beneath Abner's foot. The sound, though small, cracked through the silence like a pistol shot. Everyone stopped breathing. From inside, the laughter stumbled into quiet. A chair scraped against the floor. Seconds stretched into eternity. One voice muttered, half slurred, then broke into a laugh again. The dice rattled once more. The danger passed, but the warning lingered. They were one misstep away from ruin. The narrator asks, "What would you do if you were trapped here? If your every breath might give you away, would you press forward or would you run?" They pressed forward. At the door now. Elias raised his hand, signaling the others to wait. He listened. The overseers were slouched in their chairs, voices heavy with drink. One coughed, spitting into the fire. Another cursed his luck with the dice. Their pistols lay carelessly on the table, barrels gleaming in the firelight. The time had come. Elias pushed the door just enough to let the shadow slip inside. The hinges groaned softly, but the overseers were too drunk to care. The rebels spread like ghosts, silent, purposeful, each one knowing their role. The room smelled of sweat and tobacco, of spilled whiskey and smoke. The overseers laughed at their own crude jokes, unaware of the death crawling closer with every heartbeat. Rachel's eyes darted to one of the pistols. Her breath trembled. Abner's rope twitched in his hands. Elias gave a single nod. The ropes lifted. The air grew still. The overseers, drunk and laughing, had no idea that their last Christmas dawn had already begun. And then, the door swung wider. The firelight caught their faces, and death stepped in to take its place at the table. The overseers never saw it coming. The first man had only just leaned back in his chair, dice still clattering across the table, when the rope slipped around his throat. The sound was sudden, violent, a choked gasp that ended in silence. His chair toppled backward, crashing against the floor. Whiskey spilled across the planks, soaking into the wood like blood. The second staggered to his feet, fumbling for the pistol at his hip. But Abner was already there, the rope snapping tight around his neck. The man clawed desperately, fingers scraping skin until his nails split. His boots hammered the floor, leaving dents as he kicked for life. The third lurched from his bed, half drunk, eyes wide with disbelief. Rachel's hand shook as she pressed down with all her weight, the cord digging into his flesh. He thrashed wildly, knocking the lantern sideways, sending shadows spinning across the walls. His screams never rose beyond a strangled gurgle. The room became chaos. Fists thudded against walls, chairs shattered. A pistol fired once, the bullet burying itself in the rafters. The overseer who had pulled the trigger dropped his weapon seconds later, his face purple, tongue swollen, breath rattling into nothing. The smell of sweat and whiskey mingled with the acrid smoke of the overturned lantern. Firelight flickered across their contorted faces, catching every vein, every bulging eye, every final twitch of life leaving their bodies. Imagine standing there. Imagine hearing the rasp of rope as it tightened, the desperate scrape of boots against the floorboards. You can almost hear the rattling gasps, the muffled thuds as bodies collapsed in heaps. One by one, the overseers fell. Their power, their cruelty, their years of domination, all reduced to silence in less than a quarter hour. The dice lay scattered across the floor. One die landed near Elias's feet, the red pip of 6 catching the glow of the fire. He stared at it for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he dropped his rope, letting the body slump into stillness. Rachel's hand shook as she pulled the cord free. She stared at the man's face, once twisted with rage and violence, now slack, pale, lifeless. Her breath came in short gasps. She whispered something under her breath, a prayer or a curse, no one could tell. Abner wiped sweat from his brow. His chest heaved, his arms trembling from the force he had poured into the strangling. He looked at Elias. No words passed between them, but the silence was louder than any speech. The overseers' quarters were a tomb now. Bodies sprawled across the floor, heads twisted at unnatural angles, eyes wide in frozen shock. The ropes dangled loose, dripping sweat and spit. The fire sputtered low, throwing more shadow than light. And yet, amid the silence, there was no triumph, only dread. They had done what no one dared. They had cut the throat of the lash, silenced the men, who held their lives in fists and whips, but they also knew what would come next. Retribution, punishment, blood. The church bells began to ring in the distance. A Christmas hymn carried faintly through the cold dawn air. The sound drifted across the fields, past the cabins, past the great house, and finally into the room where death had already arrived. The contrast was unbearable. Outside, songs of joy, salvation, peace. Inside, 3 corpses cooling on the floor, the ropes still warm from the grip of rebel hands. Elias closed his eyes. For one fleeting moment, he allowed himself to feel it, the quiet satisfaction of revenge. He thought of his wife sold away, He thought of his son lost to chains. He thought of the promise that had been broken, and he whispered, "This is the only promise I will ever keep." The others stood in silence, their breath rising in white clouds, their hands shaking but firm. The deed was done. The overseers would not see another Christmas morning, but outside dawn was breaking, and with dawn would come discovery. The ropes lay slack. The overseers were dead. But as the bells tolled for Christmas, another sound was waiting just beyond the door. Footsteps. The sun rose slowly over St. Helena Parish, pale light spilling across the frozen fields. Frost glittered on the cotton stalks like shards of glass. The world outside seemed calm, almost peaceful, until the screams began. The overseers were found, just after dawn. Their bodies slumped in the quarters, faces swollen, cords still biting deep into their flesh. The dice, the whiskey, the overturned lantern. It all told the story of their last chaotic moments. The masters stared in disbelief, their voices cracking with panic. How could it be? How could the men who carried the lash be silenced in their own stronghold? Word spread like wildfire. From the big house to the cabins, from one plantation to the next, whispers of rebellion, whispers of vengeance. Some spoke in hushed tones of admiration. Others spoke in fear, knowing what always followed. And retribution did come. It always did. By midday, patrols scoured the grounds. Bloodhounds sniffed at the frosted earth. Men on horseback rode hard across the parish, their rifles glinting in the winter sun. They stormed through cabins, dragging men and women into the yard, demanding names. The lash cracked until backs bled, until cries filled the air, until someone, anyone, confessed. Elias stood tall when they came for him. He did not beg. He did not weep. He offered no names. Some say he looked his master in the eye and said, "You promised me freedom. I took it myself." Whether those words were truth or legend, no one can say, but they linger still, carried in whispers long after the blood dried. Rachel and Abner, too, were dragged from the cabins. They were bound, beaten, displayed as warnings to the rest. For every overseer strangled that night, a dozen slaves paid, the price in whips, chains, or death. The balance of power restored itself in fire and cruelty. The message was clear. For every act of rebellion, the system would answer with terror. Yet something had shifted. The masters could never again sleep so soundly. The lash still cracked, but doubt crept into their minds. If slaves could rise once, they could rise again. If overseers could be strangled in the dead of night, then even those who believed themselves untouchable were not safe. The legacy of St. Helena was not just in the blood spilled that morning. It was in the echo it left behind. Imagine the silence after the bodies were buried. Imagine the fields heavy with whispers, the cabins alive with secret prayers. Imagine standing there, knowing the punishment would be merciless, but also knowing that for one night, just one night, the enslaved had seized their power. The Christmas bells still rang that morning. Their chimes drifted across the parish, mingling with the cries of the punished and the hymns sung in church pews. To the masters, it was still Christmas. To the enslaved, it was a reminder that joy was not theirs to claim, unless they took it, and history remembered. Not in written records, not in ledgers kept by masters, but in whispers carried across generations. Mothers told the story to their children, hushed as though speaking too loud might call danger back to the door. Elders repeated it at night, around fading fires, as both a warning and a spark. What began in silence became legend. What was done in shadows lingered long after in memory, because vengeance once taken can never truly be buried. And now, as we look back, the question remains. What would you have done if your family had been torn from you, your hope stripped bare, your freedom forever denied? Would you have bowed lower? Or would you have pulled the rope tighter? The bells rang for Christmas morning, but in St. Helena Parish they rang for the dead. Stories like this must never be forgotten. If you want to uncover more untold truths, tales buried in the shadows of history, stay with us. Because what comes next will shock you even more.